Hello, it's Holy Week, it's Wednesday, which means that it's Spy Wednesday. Holy Week, the Wednesday of Holy Week has been called Spy Wednesday by some in the Roman Catholic Church and other churches because it's believed to be the day on which Judas Iscariot went to the chief priests and the elders, as described in Matthew's Gospel, and said to them, "What will you give me if I betray him?" So it's where he went to the enemy, basically, and did the negotiations to be a kind of double agent. And I wanted to read the passage that is about the betrayal of Jesus. Sorry, still coughing. About the betrayal of Jesus, but from John's Gospel. Jesus is with the disciples. He's washed their feet. They're breaking bread and sharing it at the table, and he says this. After he said some things. After he said these things, Jesus became visibly upset, and then he told them why. "One of you is going to betray me." The disciples looked around at one another, wondering who on earth he was talking about. One of the disciples, the one Jesus loved dearly, was reclining against him, his head on his shoulder. Peter motioned to him to ask who Jesus might be talking about. So being the closest, he said, "Master, who?" Jesus said, "The one to whom I give this crust of bread after I've dipped it." Then he dipped the crust and gave it to Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot. As soon as the bread was in his hand, Satan entered him. "What you must do," said Jesus, do it, and get it over with." No one around the supper table knew why he said this to him. Some thought that since Judas was their treasurer, Jesus was telling him to buy what they needed for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. Judas, with the piece of bread, left. It was night. Again, reading from Eugene Peterson's The Message, a paraphrasing of the New Testament into contemporary language. Judas Iscariot is a really fascinating character in the story. Obviously written after the fact, with the wealth of oral tradition behind these stories. The Gospels present to us from the very beginning. They paint the picture from the beginning of someone who is duplicitous, someone who is not to be trusted, someone who is a thief, someone who is he doesn't get what Jesus is about, and then actively seeks to betray him. Some would argue for his own ends, to enrich himself. Some would say because he sees Jesus as a threat and decides that he's made a mistake in following this man. In the Synoptic Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the stories around the Last Supper, the evening before Jesus is crucified, they're very similar. And each of them contains, even from the mouth of Jesus, words that are almost prophetic judgment of Judas. That it would be better for him not to have been born. That in a sense he is doomed to be punished for what he does. But John's Gospel is different. Jesus is moved by the sadness of the knowledge of betrayal. He doesn't have to be, well, there wouldn't have been brain surgeons, would there? But he doesn't have to be extremely observant even to notice that Judas is quite clearly, exhibiting different behavior. He's somehow on the outside of it all, and that Jesus is quite sure that Judas is going to betray him. No, Jesus doesn't have some kind of script that God has given to him, that he goes and looks up and says, okay, we're in that page where Judas is preordained from the beginning of time to be the one who who does what God has made him to do, which is betray me so that I can die and all the sins can be paid for. This is much more complex than that. Judas makes a choice. Jesus recognizes the choice being made and says to him, make your choice and do what you need to do, because there's an inevitability about it. But what isn't in John's Gospel is Jesus condemning Judas. Jesus, or any other part of the story, saying explicitly that somehow Judas is destined for punishment eternally or immediately. That Judas is somehow outside the love of God because of the way that he's behaving. One of the things that shaped the world enormously is the fact of human judgment. And judgment that often is made very quickly. Judgment that is made not just about people, but made about people's life eternally even. And I think that the Christian church has some way to go in many places in learning something of the humility that God asks us to have when it comes to judgment. Because it is not up to you and I to decide who is good or who's bad, who's going to heaven, who's going to hell, if we believe in those things, if they're part of our faith narrative. It's not for you and I to decide, as we quickly do sometimes, and we're helped enormously by our press and by the news reporting and by clumsy headlines, all kinds of things, to rush to judgment as to who's right and who's wrong, as though there's always a clear and binary opposite in those things. Jesus feels the sadness of Judas's betrayal, and then says to him, do it. What you're going to do, do it. But in John's Gospel, there's no violent threat. There's no condemnation. There is just the stark realization that Judas is choosing another path. I wonder how much we have to learn still as human beings about our rushing to judgment, about our desire or our need to put people into categories of good and bad, right and wrong, insiders, outsiders, residents and strangers. We somehow need to... It helps us when things are simple. But as we'll know with the whole of the Easter story, the whole of the Christian gospel, it's not fundamentally a story about being in or out, or loving God or hating God, or loving our neighbor or hating our neighbor. It's a very complex traveling we do with these stories, and in the traveling we do with them, we are hopefully learning to see more and more the complexity and the subtlety and the contradictions that are part of our convictions and our judgments and our decisions about what matters and who matters and why. And because we become aware of those things, we learn to choose against them. And our hearts are transformed, and we perhaps don't feel some of the things that we might have felt before about people of colour, or people who are not British, or people who are not like us in some other way. The story of the gospel of Jesus Christ is a story of a decisive act on behalf in God's life that creates an infinite openness to our travelling in love and grace, our transforming gradually over time, sometimes with blinding revelations that can be humiliating or wonderful about ourselves and about God. Sometimes just with subtle openings and awarenesses that come over time that help us to realize that we are not who we think we are or who we would like to be, and that we've also spent a lot of time deciding what other people are and what they are like without giving due attention or grace. Now, this isn't me making some mealy-mouthed, wishful, romantic suggestion that our lives should always be lived in benevolent kindness towards each other, and we should never rush to judgment about anything. There is evil in the world. People do despicable things, and we must call those things out. Jesus doesn't say do not be judged, says do not be judged lest you be judged yourself. The same measure you use for others must be used upon yourself, and that's often where we fall down. We're quite quick to decide what the measure is for another, but not for ourselves. Underpinning it all is grace and compassion. If we wish to be treated kindly in our weakness, even in our betrayals, then we need to treat other people kindly in theirs. That doesn't mean not expressing our emotion, not feeling our pain, not being angry. None of those things are off the table. But we don't shut the door. We don't shut the door on the possibility of transformation in other human beings. Now, I speak as someone who has enormous wounds going back in terms of family, and I don't say this glibly or easily, and I don't say it easily to any of you who might think, that's all right, Rory, but you don't know what this person did to me, or what these circumstances left me with, or what emotional, what physical scars I bear because of the things I've experienced. I've had in my life. And no, I don't. I don't speak glibly, nor do I know everybody that I'm talking to or what you've been through. But in John's Gospel, Jesus feels the sadness of Judas choosing not to have his life transformed by the dangerous adventure that is love and grace and sacrifice. And yet he doesn't stop him. And that's not because it's scripted. It's because Judas can choose. And Jesus seems in John's Gospel to hold the door open rather than shut it, as he does in other versions of the story. So whatever you find it hardest in yourself to forgive, whatever you find it hardest to forgive in the behaviors of other people, the story of Judas in this last week of the life of Jesus is for us a hopeful story. Because Judas, in John's Gospel at least, Judas is not abandoned. Maybe you think I'm reading too much into this. I'm being too kind to the narrative. I don't know. I don't think I am. But Judas is not abandoned by God. He is given his freedom. And Jesus knows how to live the consequences of that freedom. You and I have work to do. We always will. Some of that work will be about our betrayals, will be about our wounds, will be about the things that we that we find hardest to forgive, and certainly amongst all of that, the strong opinions we hold and the ways that we rush to judgment in all kinds of circumstances because someone else tells us who was good or bad, or a headline writer bends us in a particular direction. Judas is loved. You are loved and I am loved. And sometimes that can be the hardest thing for us to have to live with. Because there are also other people in our lives who are Judas. Judas to us. And the fact that they remain loved may need some work. So bless you on Spy Wednesday. I hope that you're on the journey with betrayal and with complexity and with a growing self-awareness that for all of us should continue growing for the whole of our lives, a growing awareness of those parts of us that want to shut things down into narrow, easy categories rather than remain open and widespread and loving in the face of all that we're experiencing and going through, and being ourselves. Bless you as we journey towards Easter this year, with all the things we've learned this last year about ourselves, each other, and the world. I'll be back tomorrow.